Why should you still be beholden to ideas of one person, one vote democracy as the kind of default?
I want to spend a moment on this topic of monarchy.
That's good, because the time horizons of a monarch supposedly are longer than the time horizons of a CEO, let alone a 4-year elected congressperson.
David Friedman is literally the author of Anarcho-Capitalism.
The Machinery of Freedom is his most important book, but he also has written a couple fantasy novels. If you want to check out Salamander, then I encourage you to.
LARPing as well, literally, cosplaying.
Yeah, I mean, not just that. He was one of the kind of pioneers of the LARP cosplay movement in the United States, setting up an annual function in northern Pennsylvania. So that
this would be really funny if these people weren't in charge of the world. Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Quinn Slobodian, a professor of international history at Boston University. His books, which have been translated into 10 languages, include Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, Crack-Up Capitalism, Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy, and his forthcoming Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. He has been an associate fellow at Chatham House and held residential fellowships at Harvard and the Free University of Berlin. He is the co-director of the History and Political Economy Project and is on the board of editors of the American Historical Review. Prospect UK named him one of the world's 25 top thinkers in 2024. He is considered by many to be the world's foremost historian on the subject of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is probably the most misused and abused word in today's political discourse.
Yeah.
If you look on Twitter, you will find things like neoliberalism is printing money, neoliberalism is austerity, neoliberalism is also somehow gay people in the military, but then it's the social conservatism of Reagan. How should we approach this term? What does neoliberalism actually mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the problem with is it gets used and thrown around in such promiscuous ways. And I tend to think of it being used basically in three main ways. One way is to kind of describe a period of history.
Yeah.
So often people will be like, when did neoliberalism start?
Right.
Was it the closing of the gold window in 1971? Was it the Volcker shock in 1979? Was it Thatcher and Reagan's election? And then the second question is, when did it end, or is it over? So it's a way of sort of creating an epoch understanding of this era of global capitalism. Another way it gets understood as a kind of bundle of policy instruments. So a bunch of things that you could go down the laundry list with: like privatization, deregulation, liberalization of trade, free trade, austerity, cutting back state spending. These are then seen as a kind of a pick and choose kind of package. And you can look at a country and say, like, that country went neoliberal in year X because they did things 1 to 5, or they didn't because they only did 1 and 2. So that can kind of move around the world, and you can point at different actors in different countries and say they're neoliberal. A third way, though, is to think of it as a kind of intellectual movement or an ideology. The same way you would study the development of anarchist thought or socialist thought or conservative thought. You know, you can find key thinkers, key texts, key moments when their ideas broke through. And that's the approach I tend to use because, in fact, since the 1930s, people have described themselves as neoliberals. They've stopped since, for the most part. But nevertheless, you can see this kind of evolving conversation from decade to decade, which is fascinating and kind of diverse and complex because the challenges facing capitalism at any given time are evolving too. So the work that I've done, especially in Globalists and Crack-Up Capitalism, is to sort of say, what were neoliberals worried about most in year X? Like in the 1930s, it was socialists on the one side and fascists on the other, two varieties of collectivists. So you needed to kind of find a middle ground. By the 1950s and 60s, the kind of high point of the welfare state and Keynesianism and social democracy, they were actually more worried about kind of the soft social democrats in places like West Germany and France and the United States than they were about sort of Stalin and Khrushchev and the communists. Flash forward to the 90s, it's about environmentalists, it's about feminists, it's about people pushing affirmative action, civil rights. These now are seen as like the primary opponents. So neoliberalism in that definition, and the way I've defined it, is the kind of ongoing project to protect capitalism from different forms of democracy. And what democracy looks like at any time sort of varies. But I think another really important sort of revision that I'm doing that relates to your first question is this sort of shorthand idea that neoliberalism means like the marketization of everything,
Right.
or just
right.
like markets set free, markets unleashed, markets unfettered. You know, the idea that in the 1990s and 2000s, the market ruled the globe and states were withering away or like maybe even moving towards disappearance. States are totally necessary for the functioning of neoliberalism. There was never a moment where, you know, markets took over and states vanished. In fact, what I describe in the book is we need to think of it less as kind of unfettering markets and more in terms of states encasing markets. So setting up new laws, setting up new institutions to make sure certain kind of market outcomes happen and other ones don't. So that's, you know, neoliberalism to me is actually less a theory of markets and the economy. People like Hayek actually thought that the market was a kind of sublime object which could not actually be understood. It was like resistant to knowing. So all you could do actually was set up a framework of laws around it. So in that sense, neoliberalism is kind of more of a project of state design and legal design than it is of, you know, perceiving the truth of markets per se.
People have stopped referring to themselves as neoliberals. I think that's because everyone just assumes that this is the political consensus. Like you would not need to refer to yourself as a fish in water. If neoliberalism is the elite consensus of how we should organize states and economies, then you don't need to describe yourself as that. But maybe to lay the foundation here, we can start your research surrounding the Geneva School of Neoliberalism specifically. They set up these institutional frameworks. What do we mean when we talk about neoliberal institutions? Like, what are some practical examples of that enshrining private property rights above the sovereign powers of states?
Yeah. So that, I mean, historically, that's the big intervention of globalists, because I think that even someone who's maybe taken a class in college on this, the working definition you might have a little more, you know, defined than just market set free. For neoliberalism might be something like you get on the cover of David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism, right? Which is four faces: Deng Xiaoping, Ronald Reagan, Augusto Pinochet, and Margaret Thatcher. And what he tells is a story of like a crisis of profitability in the 1970s, inflation, overly aggressive demands from the working class, you know, a period of great strike activity in the 1970s, then a counter-revolution sort of nation by nation against the power nascent of the working class. So you begin with a kind of iron fist of Pinochet and the death squads in the 1970s and the outlawing of competing socialist parties. And then it gets rolled out in slightly, you know, modified forms, country after country after country. So if pushed, people would probably say, well, the genesis of neoliberalism is somewhere around there, like in the kind of democratic crisis of the 70s, the crisis of profitability of the 70s. Yeah. What I say in Globalists is actually, no, you have to go back much, much earlier. And I look actually at the end of the first age of globalization. The first age of globalization, which historians talk about quite a bit, but isn't really necessarily part of the kind of common knowledge, is from about the 1870s to the outbreak of the First World War. So that's a period where, because of new technology, because of steamships, telegraphs, and the possibility of people and goods to move around the world with such relative ease, anchored by the gold standard, you were getting a kind of a convergence of world prices towards a kind of a common standard. So if you could sit in Hamburg and buy a kind of a pound of coffee for next year, and that would immediately activate a whole network of kind of activity and production and negotiation and sort of downstream economic effects that would then eventually come back up to the distribution of that coffee, either in Hamburg itself or someone else. So you had what we think of as globalization, you know, a single world market, a sense of interdependence, a high level of labor mobility. That was already happening before the First World War.
Right.
The First World War kind of smashed that up.
Yeah.
And I think you can understand neoliberalism partially by a kind of a nostalgia for that lost unity of the world economy before the First World War.
Yeah.
In particular, the people that I look at in that book were operating in the Habsburg Empire, you know, anchored in Vienna. The Habsburg Empire, the biggest free trade zone in Europe, managed to actually pull off this sort of solution to a puzzle that has, stumped a lot of other policymakers, which is how can you have like one economic space in which people can travel around and compete as workers, sell and buy things and compete as consumers and producers. And yet you can also give people a sense of political representation and kind of national identity. So the Habsburg Empire was both a single economic space, but a place with many nationalities who had their own schools, their own sense of political representation. So it managed to kind of square this circle of like unity and diversity that arguably, foreshadowed the challenges of globalization like 80 years later. So that thing that Peter Thiel was talking about, how can you have a continually interconnected economic space in which polities compete with each other, is kind of, some version of that was active in the kind of fragmented patchwork of something like the Habsburg Empire and, of course, the Holy Roman Empire before that. So the people like Friedrich Hayek, like Ludwig von Mises, who were socialized in that milieu, who saw the shattering of the world economy in the First World War, were really kind of fixated on the question of like, how can you reassemble some version of that where people are happy culturally, they don't feel like they're being oppressed overly, and they'll play along with the security of private property, in any parts of the space. They'll play along with the idea of labor competition. In the 1920s, things were going the opposite direction, right? All of those countries that had been part of the Habsburg Empire, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, were creating their own kind of mini manufacturing states, and they were nationalizing things, and the categories of politics and economics had been kind of collapsed. The terms that I use in the book to describe that are the ones they use themselves, which is the categories of Imperium and Dominium.
Yes.
So in Roman law and later international law, and for some of these neoliberals, Imperium was the rule of governments and of people. So you can think of states in the traditional sense as kind of the space of Imperium. But on the other hand, you have Dominium, which is the rule of property and things and ownership. And the challenge for neoliberals up across the 20th century and into the 21st is like, how can you create states, Imperium, who protect Dominium, right? Who will not try to interfere in the space of private ownership, private investment, private trade. So the vision that comes out of this is one in which the world isn't kind of split north-south or east-west, but in which there's a kind of a sphere of property sort of hovering over a sphere of government, and you try to sort of reconcile conflicts between the two. So the Geneva School that you mentioned was these people from Vienna, often expelled after the Nazis rolled into town, and through the Anschluss between Austria and Germany, moving to the center of what was then global governance, Geneva, Switzerland, and trying to figure out what kind of institutions could kind of protect property rights and free trade in a world after empire is starting to dissolve.
Right.
So there we would normally think of the League of Nations and the United Nations as kind of mostly representing national self-determination, the rights of peoples, people speaking a certain language, ethnicity, having their own space. But they were sort of asking, could these international institutions actually be used primarily for protecting like free trade, private property, investor rights?
Right.
And that's the story that's told in the book then, is from the 20s up into the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, this sort of stepwise emergence of an effective global economic governance infrastructure, which manages to kind of scale up that Habsburg model by the end of the century to the scale of the planetary.
So we're following this story over the course of, let's say, roughly 100 years. We're watching the creation of international institutions. I think a practical example of this is that if I, as an investor, put money into an oil drilling operation in Venezuela, there are neoliberal international laws that will prevent that state from sending in the army and taking my property.
Yes, so it's like placing capital rights over state rights. And that, was relevant in the interwar period of places like Czechoslovakia, as I mentioned, but it really became relevant after the Second World War with the end of European overseas empires. So the wave of decolonization that hits Africa and Asia in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s means that you have all these new states that are like, great, we have independence. That means we can make use of all of the resources within our borders, because that's what self-determination must mean.
Right.
And what else
right.
could autonomy mean if you can't, use the copper underneath the surface of the earth, and you can't use the oil in your fields?
Which would necessarily involve expropriation from the foreign investors.
It would, and it did. So in the 1960s and into the early 1970s, there were huge waves of expropriation, of nationalization of foreign-owned entities, often extractive industries, and then turning them into, public ownership.
Right.
And interestingly, that was not considered a taboo at the time. So as long as you gave just compensation, that was considered to be kind of standard and acceptable practice. There was, for the first couple of decades of the 50s and 1960s, a kind of norm by which, indeed, political autonomy could translate into a certain amount of economic sovereignty over these kind of things. What happens in the 1970s that's actually very important, in a way it's a kind of the pivot of my book, is the oil crisis, and then something called the New International Economic Order. So the nations of the UN, which had been, the UN had been totally dominated by imperial and European powers. As more and more nations became independent and entered the UN General Assembly, they were able to use the UN as a kind of a bully pulpit, but also a sort of a platform for agenda setting and demands making that went against maybe the interests of the United States and the European powers and even the Soviet Union. So the New International Economic Order in 1974 basically said, I think it's one of the most consequential efforts to oppose the project of neoliberalism across the 20th century, because you had a coalition of poorer nations, African, Asian, and Latin American, who said, you know what? Imperium actually trumps Dominium. If our states, often they were one-party dictatorships at this point, but still, if our post-colonial states decide they want to do certain things with their resources, then they should be able to. And international global economic governance should not work just to enshrine property rights, but it should work to stabilize commodity prices, create maybe even the space for colonial reparations, and allow sort of technology transfer between poorer nations. So it was really an attempt to kind of make global economic governance something that could work for redistribution in like manifestly anti-neoliberal terms.
They must have loved that.
I mean, it became, neoliberals were just hitting the big red panic button in the 1970s. It was like, oh no, this is not good. So the counter-revolution against that was really what accelerated and set into motion a lot of things to like roll back the rights of nations to do what they will with their own resources. So the example you used was kind of international investment law, which exists now, is a great example of how we absolutely don't and never have lived in a space of like unfettered markets. Actually, we have tens of thousands of bilateral investment treaties which nations sign between each other before a rich nation invests in a poor nation, which says exactly as you say. If over the next few years or in the future, that nation does anything to kind of decrease the profitability of that investment, then the poor nation can be sued by the rich nation or by the corporation itself that has invested in a third-party arbitration court. They can demand damages, and they often have and do. So the kind of possibility of an alternative modernity or an alternative form of globalization, which we sometimes associate with like the 90s in opposition to the WTO, was actually like a big Global South-led campaign in the 1970s that just got smashed with a sledgehammer.
There's a famous thought experiment around the financial crisis, which involves the total number of countries in the world. And this then lays out some interesting implications for governance and statecraft in the 21st century, particularly if you're concerned with wealth preservation.
Yeah, so this is an anecdote that I begin the book Crack-Up Capitalism with, is Peter Thiel in 2009 speculating about how many polities there should be in the world. He sort of says, how many do we have now? Pushing 200. Why can't we have more? Why can't we have 100? Why can't we have a few thousand? And the idea was to produce a kind of competitive ecosystem of government the same way that they felt they had created a new kind of set of disruptive, competitive platforms and service providers in Silicon Valley. You've taken out legacy institutions of banks and journalism. Why not do that now with the biggest kind of contract provider there is, which is government itself?
We are used to thinking of neoliberalism as a project that links a global society of free trade. But the method for achieving that involves, I think, in the interim, this competitive patchwork of special economic zones, of which I think there's something like 2,000 active SEZs.
Many more than that. There's
more
over
than
5,000.
2,000.
Yeah.
5,000. I'm out of date.
Peter Thiel is a perfect case in point, right? I mean, I begin the book with him in 2009 basically saying we need to start experimenting massively in the government space, and like we need to start, getting out of this place as soon as possible. But 7 years later, he's speaking at the Republican National Convention in support of a very, a candidate operating with a more or less conventional model of representative government, and he hasn't budged since, right? I mean, the point I make there is that it's much easier to take over an existing state than to try to create one of your own. And if you've managed to kind of bully and pressure the existing state into conforming itself to your needs, then voila, like why get out? Why exit now? So I think
it's cozy in here. You don't need to leave.
No, I mean, you can move around the country. I mean, we didn't talk about that, but there's still competitive jurisdictions state to state, and the kind of taxes that different states levy on their residents. So hence Musk moving from California to Texas, like so many others. But this fusion of private interests and service providers with the state is something that is, I think, realizing the private state model by other means, right? You don't have to do a new private state. You can simply privatize further the existing state. And that's something that Musk arguably pioneered with SpaceX. I think that's, underappreciated how important that is for him as a kind of a spearhead of policy intervention. When he first tried to compete to launch military satellites for NASA, he actually had to sue the US government because they didn't think that they needed to offer this to a private service provider. But within their own kind of pecuniary laws, they actually did need to find the lowest cost, the cheapest provider, and so he was able to win that first contract.
Is this like the post office to space?
So now he is the one who puts up all their satellites, and they can't do it without him.
I see.
So that's the trick here, is like make yourself indispensable to the sovereign, right? And then, talking about monarchic characters, I mean, Donald Trump is starting to get there, right? In the sense that he seems to have an immunity to criticism for a majority of this country almost, right? That he exists in a kind of a stratosphere of exception that seems to have transcended just the normal one of legal accountability and kind of electability. So, I think that all hail God Emperor Trump meme from 2016 was kind of on the money in certain ways.
So speaking of this period from the late 1970s to the 1980s, we've covered a lot of territory. People will talk about the election of Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK, the Volcker shock, this moment in which neoliberalism starts as a historical era, as a period. But that's when they achieve power. That's when they're actually enacting policy. They're in office and so on. Where should we properly begin the story? Is it 1947? Is it the 1930s? Where do you start this history of neoliberalism?
Well, I mean, I think, historians are famous for always saying to understand that, we need to step one step back.
Of course, yeah.
So, I mean, for me, the existence of this kind of collective of people hashing out ideas in a unbroken genealogy from 1937 onward makes it kind of a useful way to kind of bookend, all right, when did this idea of neoliberalism come about? Because the neo part was the idea that sort of laissez-faire, small state liberalism of the 19th century, in which the state just took care of kind of, ideally the night watchman state that just took care of.
This is classical liberalism.
Classical liberalism. They believed that was inadequate for an era of democracy because you couldn't anymore just, fire people en masse to bring your currency back up to parity with the gold standard the way you did in the 19th century because they had votes and you'd get booted out of office next time. So you needed to figure out a newly activist state designed to promote and protect competition, even under conditions of mass suffrage,
Right.
and eventually under conditions of global national self-determination. So those are like the twin challenges that I see in the 20th century that were quite unique, which is like, how do you protect capitalism, a manifestly sort of a system that produces inequality by its very nature, under conditions of mass democracy and decolonization, in which there's a general trend towards a principle of equality and redistribution. So that takes a lot of work, actually. And some of it is, making people happy as consumers rather than as workers. Some of it is distracting them with adventures overseas, as with the Falkland Wars in Thatcher's case, which probably saved her premiership, early in the tenure. The iron fist that goes along with the free market's invisible hand is a big part of course, histories of mass incarceration in a country like the United States and a country like El Salvador right now. Darling of the free markets, has just been given a new big loan by the IMF, has also imprisoned close to 2% of the adult population, thereby bringing the homicide rate way down, but sort of at what cost? I mean, he has an extraordinarily high approval rating, so he seems to be winning consent from Salvadorans. But I think that when talking about the protection of capital and property, it's also important to see how, methods of policing incarceration, especially obviously of people of African-American descent in this country, are ways of dealing with an economic problem, warehousing a surplus population, but also producing, investable city centers and things like that for, real estate interests.
Yeah, one of the recurrent themes that you find with any of these like market ideology type people is that although they talk about the efficiency of markets and allocating resources and so on, there is always this negative externality or something that needs to be excluded. Like you let a market run long enough and you just inevitably find this extreme polarization and asymmetry of resources. And so their commitment to using the market to allocate resources means that you are at some point you're saddled with this problem of having to get rid of the expendable people.
Absolutely. Well, that I think is the kind of the essence or what makes this new kind of exitarian strain, going back to Thiel again, kind of so symptomatic of this impasse you're describing, right? Because the idea of exit is to, have all the benefits with none of the downsides, right? I mean, so rather than figuring out how you can create a large country like the United States in which there's pockets of prosperity surrounded by like a hinterland of like precarity or poverty, and then just figure out how to keep the poor out of the pockets of prosperity and police them away. It's just like, well, what if we just took that pocket of prosperity and just relocated it outside of the actual territory of the United States?
Right.
And they look around the world for examples and they see places like Dubai and Singapore. I mean, how do both those places work? They work by importing a majority of their residents as workers with zero rights and zero claims on anything resembling citizenship, who are, in the case of Singapore and Dubai, housed separately from the wealthy parts of the population, on a kind of hire and deport rotation. In the case of Dubai, often hardly paid or not paid at all through these exploitative systems of the Khalifa labor system. And those things that to sort of, good liberals look like downsides are to, I think, exitarians like the secret of their success. So the secret is to create a situation in which people don't have a platform upon which to make legitimate claims.
Right.
I mean, if you are an American, you can always stand up and say, like, this sucks. This isn't what our country is about. We need to do better. If you are an imported migrant worker in the model of the cruise ship, which is really the kind of prototype for exitarianism, then if you say, hey, this sucks, I'm a part of this cruise ship too, they just put you off at the next port and hire the next person.
Literally, it was called Project Blue Seed from the Seasteading Institute.
Yeah.
They tried it on a cruise ship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of that stuff. And there's also really funny accounts of what happens when this actually is tried in real life. There's a great Guardian piece called about the SS Satoshi, which is great partially because it reveals that the fantasy of the sea as a kind of unregulated space is far from it, right? It's actually dense with regulatory claims. From
international waters beyond the power of nation states, can't regulate them, they can't touch you.
Exactly, that sort of Hugo Grotius vision of the open law of the sea is actually true to some extent as far as passage, but all vessels need to somehow be anchored somewhere on land. And, when you need to come back to like get, food and fuel, suddenly you're back in the kind of legal morass of the bad world as they see it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, I look at these far out anarcho-capitalists and exitarians alongside like real world examples of models they're seeking to emulate, right? So I think it's interesting inherently that someone like David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son, in the 1970s was trying to figure out how you could privatize all services that states provide and create like a totally opt-in, contract-based society, sort of taking the gated community as a model and then, maximizing that into an absolutely private polity. I think that's interesting.
David Friedman is literally the author of Anarcho-Capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Machinery of Freedom is his most important book, but he also has written a couple fantasy novels. If you want to check out Salamander, then I encourage you to.
He's got an interesting hobby of LARPing as well, literally cosplaying.
Yeah, I mean, not just that. He was one of the kind of pioneers of the LARP cosplay movement in the United States, setting up an annual function in northern Pennsylvania where people, come and put on the attire, and in the extreme versions like himself, make no reference to the modern world, use no modern amenities, and act as if you are, in his case, a 13th century Berber Muslim priest. So that
this would be really funny if these people weren't in charge of the world.
Well, it's a certain level of like radical revolutionary commitment, which I think anyone on the left can kind of like laugh at first, but then kind of have a sinking feeling like, how many of us are actually going that far? Right. I mean, how many people are like living their projected version of what a good future could look like in such regularity as someone like that, like putting in the work, organizing the other, the LARPers around him. So I think that convergence is really, it's happening in ways of just sending off so many sparks right now between sort of like wild speculative fantasies, often irrigated by science fiction, gaming, all kinds of non-embodied intersection of that with the kind of mainline policy ideas of what it means to be a good and responsible state, right? It's not for nothing that the UK after Brexit was basically looking at Dubai and saying like, how can we do the Emirates here in the UK?
Yeah.
Well, we can create little pockets of territory that strip out the regulations and laws, but you're never going to compete with Dubai, right? I mean, the fact of globalization is that you actually just end up debasing and degrading your own already, moribund social democracy, rather than coming anywhere close to that level of being plugged into the circuitry or switchboard of global capitalism.
I want to talk about exit and the zone and kind of this competition with social democracy, which I think is immensely important for the story. But very quickly to comment on the kind of LARPing component here. Patrick Friedman, also grandson of Milton Friedman, son of David Friedman. There's kind of a lineage here and a progression of this thought that grows increasingly radical, one might say. I participated in a role play based in the Discord of the Seasteading Institute, of which Patrick Friedman was a co-founder. And there are just so many overlaps between this like cosplay, LARP, suspension of disbelief, expansion of the political imagination. It's a pretty powerful tool, and these people are meaningfully shaping policy decisions, creating special economic zones, living out this fantasy. And I wonder if this gives us some important context for how to understand the crazy shit that people post on the internet nowadays, right? Because very often I will have conversations with people and they'll say like, these guys are just LARPers, they're just pretending, they're doing whatever. And it's like, I don't know, like there's billions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, I think $8.7 trillion held in offshore tax havens. These special economic zones are shaping our political reality, and they're being designed by people who literally dress up as medieval characters. Like maybe LARPing is kind of important, and we should pay attention to what these people are saying online. How do you look at these people online who make these radical posts that sometimes seem a bit like sensational or outrageous? Like when do we think about taking them seriously? So I think the development of special economic zones, which is basically China imitating Hong Kong and turning Shenzhen into what it is, and then other countries looking at it and saying, how can we have our own Shenzhen? And creating these little pockets of deregulation and, friendliness to foreign investors. I mean, those have been
in reality, mostly kind of used by states as forms of like, incentivizing investment.
Yep.
But some anarcho-capitalists and libertarians have also certainly looked at those and said, what if we can design those a little bit differently? Even Paul Romer, who's no actual wild-eyed libertarian, Nobel Prize-winning economist, was like, what if special economic zone could be something that he called a charter city that would basically be like a new colony whereby a rich country would sort of take over part of, his suggestion was turning Guantanamo Bay into a Canadian-governed SEZ, and then that could blossom a new kind of Hong Kong.
Okay.
Yeah, he literally went up to Canada and tried to push that up there.
Crazier things have been proposed,
He
I
said
guess.
we could even have Mounties in the Caribbean.
It'd be a little hot, I think, with the hats and everything.
Yeah, no, the outfit is not well adapted, but so there's that side of thing, just sort of observing developments and sort of extrapolating from them. But then I think my approach kind of as an intellectual historian isn't necessarily to focus too much on the people, but to say sort of like, what world made those people possible? Do you know what I mean? Like, to focus on everything that Elon Musk says, for example, is one approach. But the other approach is to say, like, what were the set of conditions that made him seem credible?
Sure.
And not only that, but also the world's richest man. And there, I think, the best example that people like Balaji Srinivasan use certainly is cryptocurrency.
Balaji Srinivasan is the author of The Network State.
The Network State. And he says outright, we LARPed a currency into existence.
Yep.
So why can't we LARP a state into existence? And that only seems far-fetched until you think about the fact that, in 2016, when Trump was elected the first time, $700 was the cost of a Bitcoin, and now it's 100,000. Right. So there's good kind of tangible reasons why you could say, hey, this thing that in their mind is functioning like money, that is a kind of a fundamental part of statecraft, has been kind of radically rethought and remade by us, and we're still profiting massively on the gains. Why can't we bring that approach and replicate it in fields of statecraft beyond just payment systems? Right, so, right. The world, it's not just that they are looking at the world and saying, what if? Like, the world has told them, like, you're right.
Yeah,
Like the environment of, like, infinite quantitative easing, the environment of, incredibly frothy tech market in which a few huge stocks, like, drive the whole apparatus, is not the fabulations of a couple of dudes in Silicon Valley. That's pension funds, that's people's moms and dads and aunts and uncles who are, trying to protect their retirement by investing in things that are having good gains. So the phenomenon, I think, of this radicalization of neoliberalism into a kind of exitarianism is a product of, the world that we have all kind of collectively helped create over the last 20 years. And they're not so much kind of LARPing as just kind of realizing a potential within it. And trying to find the moments where the friction appears when they seek to take the next step and it hits some kind of obstacle is kind of the approach of crack-up capitalism. Here it might be worth mentioning the example from Honduras, which many people might have heard of, but around the same time that Thiel was saying we need to create thousands of new states, and Paul Romer was saying we need to create charter cities, kind of neo-colonies. There was a coup in Honduras, and a very right-wing government came into power that was advised, as they often are, by a bunch of Hondurans who went to business school in the United States. And they were...
Never heard this one before.
They were, checking out Romer's ideas online, and they were like, we should do this. Let's sell off parts of Honduras's territory and turn them into these blank slate platforms for whatever the investors want. Mm-hmm. They'd been doing this for ages, right? There were tons of SEZs and export processing zones where Canadian underwear manufacturers could come in and basically dictate the terms. So it wasn't that different than what already existed. But they said, let's go a bit further. Let's give people the right to make their own laws, have their own police, their own courts, and in the first version that was passed, enter into treaties with other nations as if they are nations. So that's new. Yeah, that was the original proposal that had never been done before. It was the closest to like a new private state that we had seen. That got slightly watered down, but in the meantime, Joe Lonsdale, Patri Friedman, a bunch of other associated people, a guy named Michael Strong, who was close with John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, came in and started to invest and proposed that this place called Prospera, which is a small part of an island called Roatan off the north coast of Honduras in the Caribbean, would become a place where people could do a bunch of things they weren't allowed to do in the United States. Unlicensed medical testing, sort of offshore crypto stuff, obviously. Tourism is the standard approach. Other things sort of undisclosed. And very high profile. Scott Alexander endorsed this, said it was a great idea, which I think also started to unlock more VC investment. Pronomos Capital, Patri Friedman's Charter City Startup Society venture capital fund was directly involved. Everything seemed to be going swimmingly from the point of view of the right-wing libertarians. But then there was an election, and the woman who came into power was the wife of the person who had been deposed in the previous coup. And she kind of basically ran on like, throw the gringos out. Like, this is a step too far. Our sovereignty is not for sale. This is just repellent to the basic principles of like national self-determination.
If I remember, there was a unanimous agreement among all of the parliament in Honduras. Like, could you imagine any government anywhere where everyone agrees on something that they want to get these people out?
Right. But here's the problem here's where encasement comes in.
Right.
Because this had already been made part of the Constitution. So yes, it could be pulled out, but there were some hurdles. But more importantly, and this is what had actually made people feel confident about, investing their money here, Honduras was the signee to a Central American Free Trade Agreement, which did exactly what we were talking about, which is give investors the right to sue states that break the terms of the original investment contract. So suddenly now, some of people who are some of the wealthiest people in the world are suing one of the poorest countries in the world to the tune of $11 billion. So this is a situation where, the ideas and the institutions start to come together, right? This is why I take an approach that isn't just like parsing the texts, but it also isn't just like following the frankly often really dry history of like international economic law, but the moments they intersect. So like these far-flung fantasies had now come down to earth and they started to bear fruit. Patri Friedman went down and had his like Tesla key, implanted in his hand so he can open his car with a sweep of his palm. But now, facing reality, they immediately go crying, bad libertarians that they are, or honest libertarians that they are, straight to the institutions of state international law that they supposedly were out there to exit from.
Right.
So that's the scale shift I think is really important to bear in mind, is like, we're not just in a world of nation states on a kind of a checkerboard. We're in a world where nations have inside of them jurisdictions with different qualities, different terms, literally different laws. And then above that, there are international economic institutions that, usually are there to protect more the rights of capital and investors than they are of average citizens and states. And in moments like this, you see, here's a short circuit between the kind of zone of exit and the highest level of international economic law. And the two are kind of both holding nation states in a kind of a vice grip of sorts, right? And saying certain things are possible. The moment you try to do that, no, democracy isn't operative anymore.
Right. The states are kind of held hostage by capital, which is that if you don't meet our demands from within, we will exit, and we built the infrastructure to do it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I want to explore a little bit further here,
and if I can just add something to that, because I think you put it very well, that states are kind of held hostage by international economic law and global financial markets. Yeah. Because the fates of a poorer country rise and fall on its creditworthiness and its credit ranking and its sort of, how its credit is seen, its debt is seen in global bond markets. And that's such a serious power that nations sort of agree in advance, or they obey in advance, to use the kind of Timothy Snyder language about, what we shouldn't do under fascist governments. So someone wrote in a really interesting book called Why Not Default? He was saying, there's all these situations where...
Default on your loans?
Yeah, why don't nations which are sovereign lenders, are sovereign borrowers, at some point just say like, sorry, we're not paying you back.
Yeah.
Because you see in the few instances where that happened, those countries, like Argentina is one example, were so severely punished, both by international economic institutions like the IMF and by just private lenders, that it serves as like an example of what not to do. So countries will preemptively cut their own costs, make painful reductions just to avoid the prospective punishment that might come from the global financial space.
President of Argentina right now, literally an anarcho-capitalist as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, the appearance of Javier Milei on the landscape is really one of those validating moments for people who spend all their time.
It does mean something.
Yeah, for people who are like always parsing these doctrines, because half the time I'm like, why am I even taking these people seriously? And then suddenly now, like the head of state of one of the largest countries in Latin America is like, well, I see myself as more of a minarchist than an anarchist, but I do follow the work of Rothbard in combination with the insights of Mises. I'm like, oh my God.
It's not a 14-year-old teenager on Reddit.
No.
Yeah, this is an adult man who's in charge of a country.
You should do like a My Political Journey with me. If possible.
I would love to. Yeah.
It's a wild and woolly ride. And it's about navigating between the kind of like extreme market radicalism of Hans Hermann Hoppe and people like that on the one hand, and then the realities of international institutions on the other, right? So he is a master at playing both sides. I mean, he goes to the World Economic Forum, perfect example of the way that neoliberal rhetoric works. He stands up at the World Economic Forum in Davos and says, social democrats, Christian Democrats, feminists, climate activists, populists, they're all the same. They're all our enemies. They're all collectivists. And it's you in this room, you're the value creators. You're the ones who are actually coming up with ideas in the world. So we need to, I want to applaud you all. You're the ones who make wealth. And we need to build a greater wall and bulwark against
they're the ones
barbarians.
Who make it. He can lay their own bricks.
And he got a round of applause. Neil Ferguson, respected historian of the world economy, wrote a rave review of the speech. So that idea of battle lines that shift, but also sort of maintain a certain consistency over time is, well represented by someone like him, I think.
I want to try and thread a few things together here. We talked about network states. We brought up Hoppe. We've covered a little bit the Habsburg Empire. This period in, let's say, post-war, where neoliberalism sets its sights on social democracy, especially in Europe, there is a lot of theorizing about creating these zones that you talk about a lot in Crack-Up Capitalism. And this begins what I would describe as an explicit project to create a patchwork of different tax havens that can slowly drain the resources from social democratic countries, bankrupt their welfare states. And by doing so, they will be forced to meet the demands of these international institutions, link everything into the global market, achieve neoliberal utopia, and so on. There's something now that has emerged in the American political discourse that is, I think, very influential and significant, called the New Right, which contains a lot of different ideological elements. Among them are people who will talk about creating an economic patchwork governed by benevolent CEO dictators. And what we should have is a monarch who's in charge of everything while we liquidate the rest of the world into competitive markets. That sounds a lot like neoliberalism too. Are those things different in any meaningful way? Is this just the completion of this project to create this patchwork of different zones? Because it would sound like the continuity of the last 50 years is to do exactly that. Yeah.
No, it's a great question. I mean, I think that it's helpful to see the kind of slow demise of social democracy and the welfare state as partially being done the way you describe, I think, by the production of race to the bottom, offshoring and outsourcing, sites of competition and tax avoidance and so on that, as you say, kind of drain or extract surplus from the fiscal coffers of the potential welfare state because of domiciling practices of corporations just pretending they're in Cayman Islands when they're actually in the United States and whatever. I think that there's another project, which is the European Union, which I think in some ways is more consistent with what I describe in Globalists. In other words, it's not a project of exit, but or the construction of a galaxy of tax havens or offshore, low-wage manufacturing sites. But it's a further layering of kind of encasing institutions over national sovereignties. Right. So I think the EU is fascinating because it's very much a contested terrain. So you had people in the neoliberal camp who were like, the EU is great. We're doing like what one of them called the Ferrari model of integration.
The what?
The Ferrari model of integration.
Okay.
We are like, lifting barriers to competition between states so countries can't protect their own markets. We're setting up, this is really important, the European Court of Justice, which is like a judicial authority that sits above the nation states that can force nations to do things. Like you can't fund anymore through state aid this or that part of your manufacturing base that you find socially or politically important. You need to allow competition. So there was kind of a machinery of enforcing neoliberalism that was part of the European project. But at the same time, there were people inside the European project who were like, let's do something different with that. And we've seen that more in the last couple of years, right? Like, what if we have a more egalitarian EU in which there's transfers to poorer countries, in which you like regularize working conditions, especially for women, in which you can do big investments into like breakthrough technologies for green transition and things like that. So the EU isn't just a neoliberal entity, but it contains one facet that I think is sort of like the globalist institution building version of neoliberalism in miniature, which is like you don't get out of states, you put something, an encasement over top of them.
And maybe important to mention that the money supply for all of the member states of the EU is locked into Brussels, in which there is no form for democratic input.
Yeah, into Frankfurt, the site of the European Central Bank. Yeah, so you you hive off certain core state capacities to supranational authorities that you actually can't really hold accountable often. And you kind of defer governance to elsewhere. So that's, if you look at what someone like Tony Blair was saying in the 1990s or Gerhard Schröder, these are social democrats, these are socialists. But they were the ones saying like, listen, states, we're weak now, we're impotent. We can't stand in the face of the storms of globalization. Globalization is like the weather. If that means that, we're going to lose all of our manufacturing jobs, then let's just prepare for that outcome rather than try to push back against it. So that, I think is the version of neoliberalism that we have most ready to mind. And when I think someone like Curtis Yarvin or something says neoliberalism is cringe, it's probably what he's thinking of is like, this era where states kind of declared their own impotence and supineness and sort of rolled over and said, let global competition do with us what it wants to. And all politics is like a selection of consumer preferences, right? The kind of like Coca-Colonization model of what globalization and neoliberalism look like. And so the more activist version that you're describing that's now coming to the new right is kind of like, no, we want to, in a way, take back control from globalization in the sense that we want to sort of determine through the design of our own enclaves and parts of the patchwork where we want to plug in. Do we want to be a financial service provider? Do we want to be a place that does, medical research? Do we want to be a place that focuses on certain kinds of, cultural production or news production? And in the process, you then have to rethink the principle upon which that space would be governed. Now that if you've broken free from the kind of straitjacket of the existing nation state system, why should you still be beholden to ideas of one person, one vote democracy as the kind of default, or kind of one ethnicity, one language group as a default? Those seem like very old Wilsonian traditions by now. So then you say, well, what creates efficiency? Well, CEOs create efficiency. They have the concentration of power in their hands. They're accountable to a board of shareholders. And then people either take up their product or they don't. And if they are wealthy enough, then they buy themselves into a position where they're large enough holder of stock that they can influence the decision-making of the CEO. But there's a separation of kind of the allocation of resources and kind of the direction of travel for the polity and the kind of everyday life of people who otherwise just kind of live with the consequences. And that is a Singaporean model that, again, is like a Dubai model. And those places, especially Dubai, combine, interestingly, like a CEO model in which the person can be dismissed by the board at will, with a kind of a continuity principle of like bloodline, in the case of Dubai, where the sheikhs come from the Al Maktoum dynasty, and you can't get a sheikh from outside of that. It needs to be from within that. And from the point of view of Yarvin and Hans Hermann Hoppe, that's good, because the time horizons of a monarch supposedly are longer than the time horizons of a CEO, let alone a 4-year elected congressperson who's more concentrated on short-term maximization of their own, gains from that time in office, whereas a king, in their understanding, is like interested in the kind of their progeny and the kind of like the long-term outlook for caretaking the resources under their control. So I agree with you that that is a kind of new variation on the old neoliberal idea, which says that, governance is about stability, capital security, and economic freedom over political freedom. Instead of trying to figure out how you can monkey with institutions to make that idea square with the idea of democracy, which is not necessarily the same, which has been the problem for the 20th century. Right. The 21st century thing is just like, just get rid of that left-hand part and just focus on the efficiency, economic freedom part, and take people with you who are into it, and then open the door under conditions for people who might be interested as well, but don't offer any birthright sort of, ability to enter without admission fees or something.
I want to spend a moment on this topic of monarchy, because I feel like this is one of the hairpin turns in this story that takes people by surprise. Because we're used to talking about, individualists, libertarians, and whatever. They're very anti-dictator, anti-state. Right. And the idea that they would maybe prefer to live under an absolute monarch is a little bit of a strange idea. They generally describe this as a CEO dictator. We spend a lot of time on this show talking about speculative models of governance in the 21st century. And it seems to be, you gave the example of Dubai, we've talked about China a little bit, but both of these environments, while they're very different, have an extreme concentration of wealth among their capitalist class. They have an enormous amount of power invested in one individual. And then they have this kind of competitive patchwork of different regulatory zones in which there's financial services and there's manufacturing and things like this. And you kind of recreate that Habsburg Empire, which has inspired so many of these people. So can we maybe explore a little bit of Hoppe's work and how he makes that argument that persuades people who are of this libertarian mindset to embrace the idea of having a king? So that's a very bizarre political evolution.
It is in the 21st century, arguably, but even across the 20th, it wouldn't have been seen as that weird, right? So look at the Habsburg Empire. I mean, it was an empire, meaning there was an emperor.
Literally.
There was literally an emperor. And there's really interesting work by intellectual historians who says it was actually precisely these kind of liberal, often Jewish for important reasons I'll get to, intellectuals who were actually very supportive of the empire as such. So they're supportive of this combination of like dynastic political rule on the one hand, and then relatively liberal economic policies on the other.
Right.
Why? Because they felt like the Emperor Franz Joseph II in this case was able to actually protect the rights of extreme minorities in ways that a democratically elected leader might not be able to. So if, as in post First World War Hungary or Czechoslovakia, if you need to prove your like Slavic ancestry or Magyar ancestry, then what happens to people who don't fit, specifically Jews? Right. So it made sense for people from like a very small community to kind of take flight in a relatively neutral, pragmatic, universalist position of someone like, no, all of the peoples are my children or whatever. So that was actually not paradoxical. People like, Hayek added the von to his name, as part of this ennoblement process that his parents and others had gone through because they saw their interests reflected in a kind of combination of, imperial liberalism. After the Second World War is another good example. So you think about who were the kind of success stories of post-1945. One of the first one that comes to mind is Japan. But why then did the United States, let the emperor persist as the head of state nominally in Japan, even though wasn't he the one that everyone was like committing kamikaze acts in the name of and so on?
Right.
Because they also, even American post-war planners were like, a certain level of social stability is provided by this symbolic figurehead, which can serve a kind of cohesion function, can buy legitimacy and consent, that can allow a more disruptive process of economic modernization to happen at the same time.
Right.
This is a whole category of discussions in development economics in the 1960s is about developmental dictatorships. Saudi Arabia, another great example. Iran under the Shah, same thing. Globalizing, plugging into world oil markets under the leadership of a dynastic figurehead who was preferable than the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh, who the Americans helped, coup to get the Shah in power. So I think that there is a tradition and a history for that, and I think it helps to sort of make us see what the kind of balance is that many of these, especially anarcho-libertarians, want to strike between unleashed economic competition or institutionalized economic competition and authoritarian rule that makes the latter possible, the former possible. So for good reason, there's been a lot of attention to the kind of stuff that Murray Rothbard was saying in the 1990s, and John Gans has written about this. I've been writing about it for years as well. His kind of plan for the day after, so to speak, watching the Soviet Union in a period of shock therapy was very inspirational for people like Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell, who helped start the Mises Institute. They're like, okay, what do we need to do? Free prices, smash the unions, unleash the cops is one of the first things he mentions. Get rid of the bums and the vagrants. So there will be a kind of a very disruptive transitional period in the move from a kind of mixed economy model to what they hoped would be a totally anarcho-capitalist, like pay-for-use style model. So you can see that two ways, I think. And I think this is true of Hoppe and Millet too. Of Yarvin as well, which is that, okay, maybe this is just a functional kind of bloodless but practical attitude towards restoring order and stability. Or you can see that there is a kind of a libidinal sadistic desire laying not really under the surface, at the surface. Right. That's part of that. So it's not just, unfortunately, we have to smash the union so that we can, and the protesters and the gender activists so that we can, become more creditworthy in global markets in Argentina. But no, we actually want to smash the protesters and the activists. That will be pleasurable for us. And part of what we're in this for is that act, that cathartic act of the unleashing of violence. So I think that's, that's more like where the similarities between fascism and extreme anarcho-libertarian capitalism start to resemble one another too. Because if neoliberalism has always understood itself in opposition to some kind of opponent, so did fascism. Fascism's primary opponent was communism, much, to the opposition of what the head of the AfD said on Musk's stream the other day. But so fascism was defined as the desire to, reassert masculine power, crack the heads of these reds and, bring order back. And I think a lot of the anarcho-capitalist sort of fervor and glee often comes from that kind of, that idea of helicopter drops and kind of...
Pinochet maybe is the preeminent example of this. Yeah.
Who isn't a very good model, once again, if you're actually an anarcho-capitalist, because he did all kinds of state intervention, especially in the short term. Right. But he did get the murder of socialists right. And I think that's, worth a lot.
That's what really matters. That's what, as long as we're getting that, we can do a little bit of state spending on the side.
Yeah. Yarvin is an interesting one, right? Because there has been a fair amount of writing about him in which things that he pretty clearly meant satirically or meant in the spirit of exaggeration have been taken as, his outright belief. So
but that's what makes this territory so interesting, is that the guys who are making the laws for the new society are also doing the role plays. And it's hard to tell what is real and, what are they going to enact and what was meant as exaggeration or satire.
Yeah. Right? Where does shitposting
It's the same problem
policy?
As memes. Yeah. It's when does shitposting end and policy begin?
Right.
Right.
And Musk is obviously presenting us that problem a little more directly.
I think he's intentionally muddying the waters, actually. Right. He's trying to keep us on our toes and guessing.
I think, if you see Musk as a king-like figure inside of this, and he's clearly doing his best to produce a progeny that could be his dynasty, not for nothing, I have this side theory about the fact that most of his children have been born by IVF, which means that you can do sex selection of the embryos that you implant, which makes it a bit more understandable why 12 of the children born to his partners have been male at birth.
He needs a male heir to assume the crown?
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? It's like not only distinguishing the line between shitposting and policy, that's one challenge, but the time frame under which these people operate. So it's part of Musk's sort of stock and trade to describe himself as like a long-termist, right? Yeah. So everything he does is for the safety and the well-being of human civilization, whether it's voting for Trump, buying Twitter, having a bunch of kids. And that often, again, gets repeated as if it's a truism, that we can take him at his word. He's actually trying to create a multiplanetary civilization, as fanciful as that might sound. And yet, he is a creature of short-termism, in fact, right? Like he is someone who has come to the position of power and wealth that he's in because of a sense of, the pump cycles inside of hype stocks and the ability to sort of like produce momentum that becomes undeniable for people who are just being prudent kind of money managers. And it's not at all about 1,000 years hence, let alone colonizing Mars. But it's just about like holding until the price is right and dumping. So, he is actually like the consummate short-termist. And I think that's true of a lot of the tech right guys, right? I mean, I take with an enormous grain of salt the idea that they're actually interested in safeguarding the future of humanity. I mean, they're extending their own lives as much as possible because that's really the only thing that matters is their own life on this earth. Yeah,
the transhumanism stuff is, that's a whole other podcast, but this is actually very influential. This life preservation overlaps with a lot of the tech circles. But on this topic of tech, Patri Friedman is probably the biggest proponent of this, but discussing terms of service and voluntarily joining something that is run by a CEO dictator sounds a lot like the social media platforms that we use today. Elon Musk he's talked extensively about integrating payments. These platforms may have their own forms of currency. Soon they have forms of identification. They assume more and more the traditional responsibilities and roles of the state as those structures wither. And we see this kind of sprouting or flourishing of non-contiguous economic zones. Should we take these ideas of network states opting into governance that's maybe on blockchain or in the cloud? Should we take those things as serious proposals?
Well, I think, part of it rests on this verb you use of wither, like the states are withering. I would say that they are contracting these private service providers to provide the things that states used to offer, right? So that's actually what's happening is I think it's much more likely that private actors will continue to take on more and more state functions until it's difficult to find the difference between the US state and private Silicon Valley firms.
It's great when the money printer works for you.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't go to anybody else and they just pay you. That's great.
And we have a prototype for that, right? I mean, that is Alipay and WeChat and WePay in China. So that's a model of state capitalism, which is not only exists, but has proven to be, not the problem with the economic model of China, right? That's about the frontiers of real estate speculation. But I think the core here is something you mentioned earlier, which is like one thing that this flight to special economic zones does, it isn't necessarily directly drain the coffers in a kind of a mechanical sense such that the welfare state automatically kind of collapses. It produces a competitive pressure on those home states to adjust their own policies, again, preemptively, because the goalposts have been moved about what it means to tax a corporation, for example. I mean, I remember at some point during the Trump administration, the Heritage Foundation or ALEC circulating this bar graph that showed corporate tax rates. And it was like, here's the US, I think it was 35 or something at that point. And here's like Mauritius, that was like 8% or something. And like, how can this be true? How can this third world country have a lower corporate tax rate? Which is just like a mind-bending leap of logic, right? Like the idea that the biggest economy in the world should somehow be compelled to follow lockstep with like an obviously engineered tax haven is doing to draw profits away. And yet that was being presented as common sense. So that idea of, using the threat of exit to discipline the kind of incumbent, I think is more what's happening here.
There's a retreat from globalization. There's a interventionist hand in the economy. Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, a number of pieces of legislation from the Biden administration that just look very uncharacteristic of the neoliberal period. I have limited faith that Trump is going to do anything like that. But are we at some new chapter of this development? Is neoliberalism over? Is it in a new iteration now? Or how do we understand these recent developments?
Yeah, I mean, that was a question I was being asked a lot in the first year or so of the Biden administration, for good reason, right? I mean, the containment efforts of COVID-19, did things policy-wise that definitely nobody thought could be done. As far as shutting down the global economy and yet preventing it from collapsing through, furlough schemes and cash transfers and sort of tax relief for affected companies. The effects of that were also quite interesting in terms of political experimentation. I wrote at the time about the kind of cracking up of even the territorial lower 48 US into like state compacts, right? Like there was like the New England Compact was like a cluster of states that had a certain arrangement among themselves for distributing PPE, for stopping people who were crossing. I knew someone who was living in New Rochelle early in the pandemic and she couldn't leave town and people couldn't enter. So it turns out that the Imperium, to go back to the category we were talking about, like the power of the state, actually, was much stronger maybe. Like this idea of like a surrender to globalization and the market, what are governments anymore? They're just, supine actors. Turns out like, oh no, like in extremis, states will show up and they can do things that nobody thought that they could do.
Surprise, surprise. It's been that way the whole time.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And so that lots of light bulbs were going off in the heads of people of all points on the political spectrum, right? I mean, people like Srinivasan were like, amazing, sovereignty is provisional. Like it can be fragmented, like at a drop of a hat, given the right conditions. People like Andreas Malm, the climate Marxist, was like, this is great. This is like war communism, just the same way that the Soviet Union came into existence in the course of the First World War. Unexpected, unprecedented shock from outside that then changed the terms for people in terms of their relationship to the government. Let's do that. Like, let's roll out like shock communism, like right now. The very much in between the two moderate version that came out after Biden's election was the Green New Deal proposition, Build Back Better, which was then further watered down after opposition, of course, from Manchin and Sinema and so on, to the Investment Reduction Act, which was still a massive spending package designed to transform the American economy, reindustrialize parts of it, push it on a trajectory towards energy transition and decarbonization. So to talk about post-neoliberalism in 2021 was, I think, not that far-fetched. Like at a rhetorical level, we were there. I mean, the Biden cabinet and its economic advisors, none of those kind of shibboleths about the need to bow down to the natural qualities of global competition were there. It was the opposite, right? Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade representative, was one of the more overt in her belief that states had made globalization and now they can remake it in a way that's more equitable. What that actually ended up meaning, though, is that in the attempt to realize that post-neoliberal transition, we ended up seeing many of the built-in aspects of neoliberalism as kind of state legal hardware that made that such a transition impossible or hard to do. So how did the IRA get rolled out? It was basically through large asset managers like BlackRock, stepping in as the kind of backers for now what are seen as more safe investments in things like green energy through, corporate state handovers to corporate investors in different parts of the United States for solar farms, wind farms, whatever. So it still kind of looked like public-private partnerships, socializing risk, privatizing profit. For all of the ways that it seemed to transcend neoliberalism, it still had to exist inside of the like matrix of neoliberalism that had been built over decades. So when people started to question it and feel skeptical about the arrival of a new era, they had reason to. And now with the new Trump administration, we'll see how easily it is to just roll back all of those things and to, max out only sort of LNG and fracking projects, scrap solar, scrap wind, and, get back to kind of growthism for its own sake. So I think that if you think about neoliberalism first as fending off opponents of an economic freedom first, competition focused, inequality dependent model of organizing capitalism, then it's alive and well.
Yeah.
The way it's organizing global trade policy in particular throws some things into question, but not all, I think. I think it's not right to see any moves towards protectionism or tariffs as the opposite of neoliberalism.
Right.
Reagan used tariffs and voluntary export restraints and all kinds of quotas to bully Japan into opening their market for American semiconductors. It's called competitive liberalization. The way that Trump talks about using tariffs now is like you crack open Europe to American weapon systems, American LNG. This is not anti-neoliberal, right? It's showing more kind of the strong hand of the state in pressuring countries into being exposed to market competition. But the outcome in the end is still, I think, a kind of a zero-sum accrual of profits to some countries and some elites and not others. So it's a transformation or a mutation, I think, rather than a reversal or a death.
Quinn, thank you so much for talking with us today. Your work is an inspiration. Your research is so immensely valuable. These are quite literally the most important conversations and topics to talk about. So I'm so glad to chat with you today. Globalists, Crack-Up Capitalism, immense fan of your writing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.